What would you do if asked for a dollar? Offer spare change or something greater to honor? When J.D. Vance faced this choice one day, his shocking response changed lives in a profound way. The city square buzzed with activity, the sounds of conversation and footsteps echoing off the stone pavement. It was an unusually warm fall afternoon, and sunlight filtered through the trees, casting shadows across the crowd. Vice President J.D. Vance, dressed in a sharp suit, stood at a podium surrounded by officials, reporters, and photographers, ready to address homelessness and economic issues. The press had already snapped pictures of him shaking hands and giving brief statements on his commitment to reform. Amid the event's bustle, a figure caught the crowd's attention. Hank, wearing a faded military jacket and worn shoes, stood on the sidelines, observing quietly. His face was weathered, his eyes tired but sharp. He wasn't seeking attention, but he carried the weight of a story no one seemed to want to hear. For most, he was invisible. Hank hesitated, unsure how to approach Vance. He wasn't one for crowds, but today felt different. With nothing left to lose, he took a step forward, his boots tapping on the pavement. When he was close enough, he cleared his throat, and his rough, worn voice cut through the air, simple yet striking. "Can you give me a dollar?" Hank asked, the words coming out with a weight of desperation, but also with a strange humility. The crowd around them paused, their eyes shifting between the vice president and the homeless veteran. Some people looked away, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. Others seemed to silently judge. There was a murmur in the crowd, a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. A few reporters, caught off guard, raised their cameras, preparing to capture what could easily turn into another story about the disparity between political elites and the struggling masses. But what came next wasn't what anyone expected. J.D. Vance, who had been in the middle of a conversation with a local official, turned his head toward Hank. His expression softened, his eyes narrowing in recognition, not just of the man before him, but of the weight of his request. There was no hesitation in his response. Instead of offering a brief nod or a polite refusal, Vance stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward Hank. But instead of simply handing over a dollar or ignoring him altogether, he did something that stunned everyone. He knelt down to Hank's level, bringing himself eye to eye with the veteran. The crowd fell silent, the unexpected act of vulnerability catching everyone off guard. Vance didn't just look at Hank. He looked into him. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the noise of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them standing in that quiet connection. "Tell me your story," Vance said softly, his voice low but full of sincerity. "What's your name?" Hank looked at him, surprised by the question, but he didn't back away. It wasn't the first time he'd been asked to share his story, but it was the first time someone had done so with real curiosity, without an agenda or a sense of pity. "Hank," the veteran replied, his voice a little shaky. "Hank Peterson. I served in the Gulf War." Vance nodded, his face unreadable, but his eyes were attentive. He didn't rush Hank. He allowed the veteran to speak at his own pace. Hank hesitated before speaking again, his words coming slowly. "After I came back, it wasn't the same. I lost my job, my family. It's hard to shake what you've seen, what you've done. They don't tell you about that part." His gaze dropped, hand tugging at his jacket. "I've been living on the streets, just surviving." The crowd gathered closer, unsure how to react. Some leaned in, others shifted uncomfortably, but Vance listened intently, absorbing every word. It wasn't just about Hank, it was about all the veterans left behind. Instead of offering a coin, Vance reached into his wallet and handed Hank a $100 bill. The gesture was bold, but it was more than money. It showed Hank's humanity mattered. Vance's next words struck a chord with everyone present. "We'll get you help, Hank," he said firmly. "This isn't just about $1. It's about making sure veterans like you get the support you need. I'm going to make sure of it." Hank blinked in disbelief, the weight of Vance's words sinking in. It wasn't the $100 bill that mattered. It was the promise of real, tangible help, something Hank hadn't felt in a long time. Vance stood, turning to address the crowd. "We need to honor our veterans, not just in speeches, but with action. It's time for a change." The buzz in the crowd shifted, and for the first time, they weren't talking about politics. They were talking about humanity. Hank stood quietly, still processing the kindness and the new hope in front of him. As Vance waited, Hank's eyes dropped and he began to speak, his voice heavy with years of pain. "I served in the Gulf War," he said, fingers fidgeting with his jacket. "I was proud to serve. I still am. We thought we were doing the right thing, fighting for our country." He paused, looking up at Vance, who listened without pity, only understanding. "But when I came back, it wasn't the same. They didn't tell us how hard it would be, how invisible we'd feel." Vance's eyes reflected recognition, and Hank felt for the first time truly seen. "I started drinking a lot," Hank admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I thought it would help, to numb the things I saw, the things I did. But it only made things worse. My mind, it wouldn't stop. The flashbacks, the nightmares." He shuddered slightly, the memory of it all still raw. "I couldn't keep a job. I tried, believe me, but I couldn't hold it together. My hands shook. I couldn't focus. And when I'd snap, when I'd get angry over nothing, it wasn't like I was the man I used to be. I wasn't in control anymore. I couldn't be." Vance shifted slightly, leaning in just a little, as if to show Hank that he wasn't alone in this moment. Hank could feel the heat of his gaze, steady and unwavering. "I lost my family too," Hank continued, the words almost too much to bear. "My wife, my kids, they couldn't handle it. I was never the man they needed me to be. I couldn't even be the man I needed to be. I pushed them away. They left. I had nothing left, not even the strength to keep fighting." Hank's voice faltered, and for a moment he looked away, his gaze flicking over the crowd. But the faces of the onlookers had blurred into the background. What he saw instead were images from a long time ago. His wife's tear-filled eyes as she packed her bags, his son's confused look as he asked why his dad wasn't coming home anymore. And the worst part, Hank had never been able to answer. "I ended up on the streets," Hank went on, the shame in his voice unmistakable. "It wasn't like I thought it would be, you know? You think you're tough, that you can survive anything, but you can't. Not when you don't have the tools, not when your mind won't let you. I begged, I drank, I fought to stay alive, but it wasn't living, it was just existing." As he spoke, Hank's voice wavered, and his hands trembled slightly as if the act of saying the words made them more real than they had ever been. He wasn't looking for sympathy, but the vulnerability he had kept hidden for so long seemed to pour out now, raw and unfiltered. He wasn't just telling his story anymore. He was laying bare the truth of his life, something he had kept locked inside for years. The crowd, who had watched silently until then, shifted uncomfortably as Hank spoke. Some people looked away, unsure how to react to such an honest outpouring. Others watched with growing empathy, recognizing that the story unfolding before them wasn't just about a homeless man asking for $1. It was about a man who had been forgotten by his country, by his family, by society. And yet here he was, standing in front of them, asking for nothing more than to be seen. Vance, however, didn't look away. His gaze never wavered, and Hank could feel that steadiness. He wasn't judging him. He was listening, truly listening, as though Hank's story was the most important thing in the world in that moment. It wasn't the kind of attention Hank had ever gotten before, especially not from someone like Vance, someone in power who could easily have ignored him like so many others had. "Tell me about the hardest part," Vance asked softly, his voice full of understanding. It wasn't a generic question. It was a genuine attempt to understand the depths of Hank's pain, to bridge the gap between their worlds. Hank swallowed again, his throat tight. He had to choose one part, and the hardest part was the part he had buried deep down. "The hardest part," Hank said quietly, "was realizing I wasn't even living for myself anymore. I was living just to survive, just to make it through the day. But I didn't care about anything. I didn't care about myself. I didn't care about the future. It was like I was dead already, just walking around in a shell." As Hank spoke, the tension in the crowd seemed to dissolve. The media, who had been recording, ready to pounce on the next soundbite, now listened with a different kind of attention. What they were witnessing wasn't just a moment of political theater. It was something real, something human. The cameras still clicked, but now they captured more than just an image. They captured a moment of understanding. Vance's face softened, his voice steady as he responded, "Hank, your story matters. You matter. And we need to make sure that veterans like you get the care and support you deserve. This isn't just about one man, it's about all of us. It's time for change." The crowd stood still, listening intently, some with tear-filled eyes, others nodding in agreement. Hank's story had opened something inside them. And though the journey ahead would be long, it was a journey that had to start somewhere. It started here, with one man, one story, and the recognition that change was possible. The silence that had enveloped the crowd since Hank's revelation hung in the air like a collective breath held in anticipation. The tension was palpable, every person present caught in the gravity of the moment, hanging on to Hank's every word as if it were a lifeline to understanding. The world around them seemed to fade, leaving just Hank and Vance, two men from vastly different walks of life, yet inexplicably connected in this moment. It was here, amidst the mix of skepticism and hope, that Vice President J.D. Vance chose to act. Vance took a slow, deliberate step forward. The eyes of the crowd followed him, and for a moment it felt like the city square had become a stage, with Vance as its central figure. His face, normally stoic and measured, was softened now with a genuine concern that few had seen before. His voice, when he finally spoke, was firm, but there was an undeniable empathy in it, a quality that seemed to surprise even the onlookers who had expected a politician's scripted answer. "Hank," Vance began, his gaze fixed on the homeless veteran, "what you've shared today, it's not just your story, it's the story of so many veterans who have come home and been left behind. It's the story of a system that has failed those who gave everything to this country. It's not enough to say, 'Thank you for your service.' We need to do more than that. We need to act." The crowd stirred, murmurs passing through the onlookers. The press, too, was on edge, their cameras trained on Vance, eager to capture every word. It wasn't every day that a politician spoke with such conviction about an issue so many had long neglected. "I'm not here to offer empty words," Vance continued, his voice growing more resolute. "I'm here to make sure we take responsibility for those who have been forgotten. I'm here to make sure that no more veterans end up like Hank, alone, struggling, ignored. It's time we take real action." He paused, glancing at Hank, who stood there quietly, his eyes brimming with emotions too complex to articulate. Vance took a deep breath before he turned back to the crowd, his words echoing through the square. "Today, I'm announcing the launch of a national initiative called Honor and Recovery. This program will provide immediate support to homeless veterans, shelter, medical care, access to mental health services, and, most importantly, a pathway to reintegration into society." The crowd reacted immediately, a wave of applause sweeping through the square. The media captured the moment, their cameras flashing, eager to broadcast the declaration to the world. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of hope in the air, a hope that perhaps, this time, something real might change. But not everyone was so quick to buy into the optimism. A few skeptical voices from the crowd murmured, questioning whether this was just another empty promise. The cameras zoomed in on Vance, and a few reporters began scribbling notes, no doubt preparing their own takes on whether this was a genuine turning point or another political move designed to appease the masses. Vance didn't flinch in the face of skepticism. He knew that words were only the beginning. The true test would come with the follow-through, the implementation of the Honor and Recovery Initiative, and whether it would make a tangible difference in the lives of veterans like Hank. He turned back to Hank, who had been standing there still processing the sudden turn of events. The weariness that had once dominated his face was now replaced by a flicker of cautious hope, the first real sign of light in a long time. Vance reached out and placed a hand on Hank's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and trust. "We'll take care of you," Vance said quietly, his voice just for Hank. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." A few of the onlookers shifted, some wiping tears from their eyes, others nodding in approval. This wasn't the kind of moment they were used to seeing in politics. This was raw, this was real, and yet there was an undeniable sense of wonder at the vulnerability and sincerity that Vance was displaying. "Right now," Vance said to the crowd, We're taking Hank to a shelter where he'll receive food, medical attention, and a place to rest. This is just the beginning. I'm committed to making sure every veteran gets the care they deserve. No more waiting, no more suffering in silence. The crowd clapped again, this time with more sincerity, though some remained unsure if the promise would lead to real change. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment from every angle. The media would cover it, but the question remained, would action follow? As Hank was escorted by volunteers, his steps slow, his eyes scanning the scene in disbelief, there was a sense of cautious hope in the air. For so long he had felt invisible, but now, with Vance's words lingering, he sensed someone was finally listening. Vance watched Hank for a moment, his resolve unwavering. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. As Hank was led to the shelter van, Vance spoke loud enough for the crowd to hear. This is just the beginning. We will not stop until every veteran has the recovery, dignity, and future they deserve, and we will start with Hank. The applause was louder now, though still tinged with skepticism. People were starting to believe, but the real test would come when the initiative moved beyond words and promises. Would it lead to real reform? Would it provide lasting change? The cameras and the reporters would carry the story far and wide, but only time would tell if this was a turning point or another fleeting moment of political hope. As Hank climbed into the shelter van, he cast one last look at the square. Uncertainty lingered in his heart, but now there was something new. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The evening had settled quietly. The city square where Vance had spoken earlier seemed distant now, as he sat in his office, staring out at the twinkling city lights. Hank's story, the raw honesty, the unspoken pain, echoed in his mind. He hadn't expected it to affect him so deeply, but it had. Hank's voice, full of emotion, brought back memories Vance hadn't thought about in years. His thoughts drifted to his childhood, his grandfather, a Vietnam War veteran. Vance remembered how his grandfather would sit, distant and haunted, staring at old photographs of the war. He never spoke much about it, but Vance understood later that the war had stolen parts of him. The trauma had left him disconnected, struggling to fit back into civilian life. I promised myself I wouldn't let this happen again, Vance muttered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. The weight of the day's events pressed down on him. Hank's story had reopened something in Vance, something deeply personal. He could no longer ignore the harsh reality that too many veterans had been abandoned after their service, left to fend for themselves with little more than their memories and their pain. He reached for his phone, dialing the number of his senior advisor, Karen, who had been with him through his campaign and was well-versed in the political intricacies of making promises a reality. Karen, Vance began, his voice steady but determined, I need to set a meeting. We're turning honor and recovery into something actionable. This can't be just another initiative. We need a national plan that provides real support, mental health services, job retraining, medical care, housing. Every veteran deserves a future, and we have to make sure they get it. Karen's voice crackled through the phone, a mixture of both surprise and understanding. JD, this sounds like a massive undertaking. We'll need to get the right people on board, the right funding. There's a lot to navigate. I know, Vance replied, but it has to happen. I can't just stand there and make promises if I'm not willing to put in the work. We're going to need bipartisan support. We're going to need the experts in veterans care, in mental health, in housing, but I won't back down on this. I won't let Hank be just a story. This is a fight for every man and woman who wore the uniform. He hung up the phone with a renewed sense of purpose. The path forward was clear, but it would require dedication, collaboration, and the resolve to keep the focus on the veterans, not the politics. Vance knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. Meanwhile, Hank had been driven to a local shelter, his thoughts still swirling from the day's events. The shelter was far from luxurious, but it was a refuge, a place where he could take a deep breath, feel safe for the first time in years, and start to make sense of what had just happened. For the first time in a long while, Hank wasn't just existing, he was beginning to feel the faintest stirrings of something he thought had long passed. Hope. As he entered the shelter, he was greeted by a warm, friendly volunteer who introduced herself as Laura. She led him to a small intake room where a counselor was waiting. "Hank," the counselor said, extending a hand, "we're glad you're here. We want to help you get on the right path, to give you the support you need." Hank wasn't sure what to expect. He had been in and out of shelters before, but this time something was different. The kindness wasn't forced or patronizing. There was no judgment in the air, no subtle reminders that he didn't belong. It felt like a place where he could begin to heal. As he sat down with the counselor, the conversation was easy. The counselor asked about his military service, about his family, about what had brought him to this point. For the first time, Hank found himself talking, not just about the war, but about everything that had come after. His pride in serving, his shame over the years lost to alcohol, his regret over the family he had pushed away. He spoke of his nightmares, his anger, the times he had lashed out, unable to control his emotions. The counselor listened attentively, nodding as Hank spoke. She didn't rush him, didn't try to offer quick fixes or platitudes. Instead, she offered understanding, a kind of empathy Hank hadn't received in a long time. As the session ended, the counselor handed him a list of resources, everything from mental health services to job training programs. "We're here for you, Hank," she said gently. "Take it one step at a time. We'll walk this path with you." Hank left the intake room feeling something he hadn't felt in years, the first spark of something good. His body was still worn, his mind still heavy with the baggage of the past, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone in carrying it. There was a chance now, a chance to rebuild, to find a sense of purpose again. As Hank wandered through the shelter, he noticed a few familiar faces, other veterans, people who had been through the same battles he had. One man, an older veteran named Joe, caught his eye. Joe smiled warmly and waved him over. "You served?" Joe asked, his voice rough with age and experience. "Yeah, Gulf War," Hank replied, a little hesitant but relieved to find common ground. "Me too," Joe said, grinning. "I've been through the wars, kid. And let me tell you, you're not alone. Not anymore." Hank felt something shift in him then. For the first time in a long while, he felt a connection. One that went beyond survival, beyond the years of struggle. It was a bond forged in shared experience, in understanding, and for the first time, Hank felt that maybe, just maybe, his new beginning wasn't as impossible as he had once believed. As he lay in his bed that night, the room quiet around him, Hank allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't have to be defined by his past. He thought about the promise Vance had made, about the words he'd heard, and he felt a glimmer of hope. It was fragile, still new, but it was there. Months had passed since the day Vance had made his public promise to Hank, and the echoes of that moment were still resonating across the nation. What had started as a single act of compassion had evolved into something far greater, a movement that sought to heal the wounds of those who had served their country and been left behind. The Honor and Recovery Initiative, which Vance had launched with fervor and determination, was no longer just a promise. It had become a reality. The nationwide rollout of Honor and Recovery had been met with both excitement and skepticism, but it had exceeded expectations. Programs aimed at addressing the mental health crisis among veterans had been launched in cities and rural areas alike. These programs, staffed by mental health professionals with experience in trauma, focused on providing veterans with the tools they needed to manage PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Affordable housing initiatives, specifically designed for veterans, had given them a chance to find stable homes after years of homelessness. And job training programs had opened up new opportunities, helping veterans transition into meaningful careers after their service. Across the country, veterans were speaking out about how their lives had changed. Testimonials from men and women who had once felt forgotten and hopeless were now filled with gratitude and optimism. "I've been out of the military for over a decade," said Sarah, a veteran from Georgia, her voice steady but emotional. "I had lost everything, my home, my family. I was living on the streets for years and I didn't know how I was going to survive. But Honor and Recovery gave me a second chance. I got the mental health support I needed, found a place to live, and now I'm working as a counselor to help other veterans. I never thought this day would come. Another veteran, Mark, a former Army medic, shared how the initiative had impacted his life. I was on the verge of giving up. I didn't know how to fight the battles in my head anymore. But honor and recovery connected me with a support group and helped me find a job at a nonprofit. I feel like I'm finally giving back in a way that matters. As these stories spread, the initiative gained more traction. Veterans who had long felt forgotten were now being embraced, their sacrifices recognized, and their futures supported by a system designed to care for them in the ways they deserved. Meanwhile, Hank had become a symbol of the initiative's success. No longer the man on the street asking for a dollar, Hank had transformed into a vibrant, healthy individual with a newfound sense of purpose. He was thriving in a transitional housing program where he had access to not only a safe place to live, but also the support he needed to rebuild his life. The shelter had connected him with job training and education programs, and Hank was now preparing for a steady job in construction, something that had once seemed impossible. The changes were evident in Hank's appearance as well. His worn military jacket had been replaced by a crisp new uniform, and his eyes, once heavy with the weight of his past, now sparkled with a renewed sense of hope and confidence. The rawness that had once defined him was still there, but it had been tempered by the resilience he was building day by day. Hank had found his footing, and the future now seemed within reach. The culmination of Vance's work came on a crisp autumn day as he stood at the grand opening of a new Veterans Resource Center, one that had been named in honor of Hank's journey. The center, Hank's Haven, was a place where veterans from all walks of life could come to find the support they needed, whether it be counseling, job training, housing assistance, or simply a community that understood their struggles. Vance stood beside Hank as the ribbon was cut, the gathered crowd applauding. The pride in Vance's eyes was evident as he watched Hank step forward to deliver a speech that was as heartfelt as it was powerful. "Thank you," Hank began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you to everyone who helped me along the way. People who didn't give up on me when I didn't have the strength to believe in myself. And thank you to Vice President Vance, who showed me what true leadership looks like. You didn't just see a man asking for a dollar. You saw a person. You saw a veteran who needed help. And you didn't just make a promise, you kept it." The crowd was silent, listening intently as Hank continued, his words raw and sincere. "There's no way I could be standing here today without the kindness, the compassion, and the belief that I could make something of myself again. This place, Hank's Haven, it's not just a building. It's a symbol of hope. It's a symbol that we're not forgotten, that we matter." Hank's words resonated deeply with those who had gathered for the occasion. The veterans in the crowd, many of whom had faced their own battles, nodded in agreement, their eyes reflecting the shared struggle and the shared hope that this new beginning represented. When Hank finished his speech, the applause was deafening. Vance stepped forward, placing a hand on Hank's shoulder. "Thank you, Hank," Vance said, his voice filled with pride. "You are the embodiment of what we strive for in this country. You remind us all that our veterans deserve not just our gratitude, but our action." As Vance addressed the crowd, his words were firm, yet filled with empathy. "Today, we're not just opening a building. We're opening doors for every veteran who has been overlooked, abandoned, or left behind. This is just the beginning. We must continue to honor our veterans, not just in words, but in deeds. The fight for their future doesn't end here. It continues, and we will be right beside them every step of the way." The crowd erupted in applause once again, but this time, it wasn't just for Hank's transformation or for the new resource center. It was for the realization that this initiative, this movement, had the power to change lives, to heal wounds, and to offer veterans the future they deserved. As the sun began to set on that hopeful day, Vance and Hank stood together, watching as the Veterans Resource Center came to life. The building was bustling with activity, veterans exchanging stories, connecting with counselors, filling out job applications, and finding camaraderie. It was a place where healing had begun, where futures were being rewritten, and where hope had found a home. For the first time in years, Hank felt like he belonged. And for the first time, he could see a future where he was no longer defined by his past, but by the strength and resilience he had found within himself. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living, and that he knew was the true meaning of recovery. The closing image of the bustling center was one of promise, a reminder that with leadership and compassion, even the most difficult battles could be won. And for Hank, and for every veteran who had walked the hard path before him, it was a symbol of the brighter future they now had within their reach.